The American Revolution. Part 2. Fire and Freedom. The war begins 1775, 1776. April 1775. Smoke still hung over Massachusetts. The battles of Lexington and Concord had ended, but the war had just begun. The British Army, proud and disciplined, retreated to Boston, a city surrounded by angry colonists turned soldiers. Within weeks, nearly 20,000 militiamen from across New England poured in, forming a loose ring around the city. Farmers who had never left their towns now stood shoulder to shoulder with men from other colonies, armed with old muskets, pitchforks, and courage. They didn't yet have uniforms or training, but they had something the Redcoats didn't: a reason to fight. In June, the British decided to break the siege. They moved to take the high ground across the harbor, Bunker Hill. The colonial troops fortified nearby Breed's Hill, waiting. When the red lines of British soldiers marched uphill under a blazing sun, the Americans held their fire. The air was tense. Then came the famous order, shouted by Colonel William Prescott: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The first volley tore through the British ranks. Twice they charged, and twice they fell back, leaving hundreds dead. Only on the third assault, when the colonists ran out of ammunition, did the British take the hill. It was technically a British victory, but at a cost so high that one general muttered, "Another such victory would ruin us." The Americans had proven they could stand against the greatest army in the world, the olive branch and the iron fist. While muskets thundered around Boston, the Second Continental Congress met again in Philadelphia. The delegates were torn. Some, like John Adams, believed war was inevitable. Others, like John Dickinson, still hoped for peace. So they sent a final gesture to King George III, the Olive Branch Petition, declaring loyalty but pleading for reconciliation. The king never read it. By the time it reached London, he had already declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. To him, these were not patriots. They were traitors. He hired thousands of German mercenaries and ordered more troops to crush the uprising. The door to peace slammed shut. Enter George Washington. When George Washington arrived outside Boston to take command of the Continental Army, he cut an impressive figure. Tall, dignified, silent. But the reality he faced was grim. His army was a disorganized mix of farmers and volunteers. They had little gunpowder, no real uniforms, and only a handful of cannons. Still, Washington had one advantage: leadership. He turned chaos into discipline. That winter, a young bookseller turned artilleryman named Henry Knox undertook an impossible mission, hauling 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York, more than 300 miles through snow and mountains. When the guns arrived in March 1776, Washington's troops positioned them overnight on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the British in Boston. At dawn, British General Howe woke to see cannons aimed straight at his ships. He had no choice. On the 17th of March, 1776, the British evacuated Boston. For the first time, the colonists had driven the British out. Bells rang across America, but the celebration was short-lived. The empire wasn't done, it was just getting started. The world takes notice. As fighting spread, word of the rebellion crossed the Atlantic. In France, ministers watched closely. They remembered their humiliation after losing the 7 Years' War to Britain, and saw in the American struggle a chance for revenge. French diplomats began secretly sending gunpowder and weapons to the colonies through front companies and smugglers. Ships carrying supplies under fake flags sailed into American ports. Every musket, every barrel of powder from France meant another chance for the colonists to survive. At the same time, Spain and the Dutch Republic also began to whisper their sympathy. The idea of Britain being weakened thrilled them all, but public support would take time. No one wanted to bet on a losing side. The Americans had to prove they could win first. The turning point, in words. By 1776, the colonies were no longer simply fighting taxes. They were fighting for identity. Then, in January, a pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia that set fire to every tavern and parlor across America. It was called Common Sense, written by a radical Englishman named Thomas Paine. He spoke in plain, fiery language. "'Tis time to part." He mocked monarchy itself, arguing that no man had the divine right to rule another. Paine's words spread like wildfire. In a few months, over 100,000 copies were printed, an astonishing number for the time. For the first time, ordinary Americans began to believe not just in rebellion, but in independence. The idea that had once been whispered in corners was now shouted in the streets. The Declaration of Independence. By the summer of 1776, it was clear there could be no turning back. The Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. On it were 5 men: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, only 33, took the lead in writing. For days, he sat in a rented room in Philadelphia, crafting the words that would define a nation. He wrote not just for Congress, but for history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Bells rang, cannons roared, and crowds cheered, though few fully understood the danger that came with that signature. Every man who signed had just committed treason. If captured, they would hang, but they signed anyway, one by one, as quills scratched across parchment. A nation was born. The British strike back. Britain didn't wait long to respond. That same summer, the largest military expedition it had ever sent across the ocean arrived off the coast of New York. Over 400 ships, carrying 32,000 troops. To the Americans watching from shore, it was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Washington moved his army to defend New York, but the British struck hard. In August 1776, they crushed the Americans at the Battle of Long Island. Washington's army barely escaped, retreating across the East River under cover of fog, a miracle that saved the Revolution. Over the next months, the Continental Army was pushed out of New York, through New Jersey, and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By winter, morale was broken. Soldiers deserted. Supplies ran out. The dream of independence looked like it might die before it had even begun. The night of courage, Trenton. Then came one of the boldest moves in military history. On Christmas night, 1776, as icy winds howled and the Delaware River froze, Washington decided to strike back. His target, a garrison of 1,400 Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. The river was choked with ice, but Washington ordered the crossing anyway. Boats creaked through the dark. Men shivered, their muskets soaked. By dawn, they attacked, catching the Hessians completely off guard. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Nearly 1,000 enemies were captured. When Washington returned victorious, the news spread like fire. The revolution, once gasping, breathed again. The men who had been starving now had hope. The people who had doubted began to believe. A nation's spirit, The early years of the revolution were not defined by easy victories, but by unyielding will. Every farmer who hit a soldier, every woman who sewed a flag, every printer who risked his press for the cause, they were part of something bigger than themselves. The Americans had no empire, no navy, and no promise of success. But they had conviction, and that was enough to keep the fire burning. Across the Atlantic, kings and ministers began to whisper, "Perhaps the rebels cannot be crushed after all." And in the courts of Europe, plans began to form. Secret alliances, quiet promises, ships preparing to sail. Help was coming. The world was about to join the fight. Next story, part 3.